December 22, 1944, 11:30 a.m., Bastogne, Belgium. The frozen breath hung in the air as Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard watched for German officers approach through the snow, their white flags stark against the devastated landscape. They carried with them a message that would echo through history, an ultimatum demanding surrender, wrapped in the confident mockery of certain victory. The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA: troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The German officers waited, supremely confident. They had every reason to be. 18,000 Americans were trapped, surrounded by approximately 30,000 German troops with hundreds of tanks. No supplies could reach them. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft. The nearest relief forces were over 100 miles away. What they didn't know was that 130 miles to the south, General George S. Patton had just made a promise so audacious that even Eisenhower thought he was joking, a promise that would require moving an entire army through impossible winter conditions faster than any military force had ever moved before. The mathematics of war were about to be rewritten, not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by the collision of German overconfidence with American determination, and by the sheer audacity of a general who refused to believe in the word impossible. The transformation had begun 6 days earlier, in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944. At precisely 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest erupted with a violence that hadn't been seen on the Western Front since 1940. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, their shells screaming through the frozen air toward unsuspecting American positions. Among them was Private First Class Robert Leakey of the 99th Infantry Division, who would later write in his diary, "The earth shook beneath us. Trees exploded into splinters. The very air seemed to scream. We had been told the Germans were finished. We had been told wrong." This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble to reverse the tide of war. In absolute secrecy, the Wehrmacht had assembled 410,000 troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces. They had moved this massive force through the dense Eifel forest at night, maintaining radio silence, using horses to move supplies to avoid engine noise. General Major Hasselkoke, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, recorded the moment before the attack. The soldiers stood silent in the darkness, their breath freezing in clouds before their faces. They knew what was at stake. This was not just another offensive. This was our last chance. The target was the weakest point in the Allied line for American divisions spread thin across difficult terrain, many of them new to combat or recuperating from earlier battles. The Germans achieved complete tactical surprise. Within hours, entire American units were overrun or retreating in chaos. But the German plan had one critical requirement: speed. They needed to capture the vital road junction at Bastogne within 48 hours. 7 major roads converged there, roads that German tanks needed to reach their ultimate objective, the port of Antwerp, 125 miles away. Without Bastogne, the entire offensive would stall. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps tasked with taking Bastogne. His force was formidable: the elite 2nd Panzer Division with 88 tanks and assault guns, the veteran Panzerlehr Division with 57 tanks, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division with 17,000 infantry. Racing toward the same objective from the opposite direction was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. They had been resting in Reims, France, recovering from 72 days of combat in Holland when the call came. No winter clothing, no time to prepare, just grab your weapons and get on the trucks. December 17th, 9:00 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 14°F as the first trucks carrying the 101st Airborne rolled through the darkness toward Bastogne. Private Donald Bulge of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment remembered the journey vividly. We passed endless columns of American troops heading the opposite direction, retreating. Some had no weapons. Many had no helmets. They shouted at us through the darkness, "Go back. Go back. They'll kill you all." One soldier, his eyes wide with terror, grabbed my arm and said, "There's thousands of them. Tigers, panthers, everything. I pushed him away. We weren't going back. The convoy stretched for miles, 380 trucks carrying the division through the night. They had no idea what they were heading into. Maps were scarce. Intelligence was contradictory. All they knew was that they had to reach Bastogne before the Germans. At dawn on December 19th, they made first contact with the German spearheads. Sergeant William McCloskey, a tank commander with Team Desabry, described the initial encounter. The fog was so thick you couldn't see 50 yards. Then we heard them, the deep rumble of German armor. When the first Panther emerged from the mist, it looked like a monster. Our 75mm rounds bounced off its front armor like ping-pong balls. We had to let them get close, dangerously close, to hit them from the side. The battle for Noble raged all day. Team Desabry, with just 15 Sherman tanks, faced the entire 2nd Panzer Division. They held for 48 hours, destroying 31 German tanks before being ordered to withdraw. Major Desabry was severely wounded when a German shell hit his command post, but his sacrifice had bought precious time. December 20th brought a new commander to Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe arrived to take temporary command of the 101st Airborne. While Maxwell Taylor was in Washington, McAuliffe was an artillery officer by training, known for his calm demeanor under pressure. He would need every ounce of that composure in the coming days. The situation map in McAuliffe's headquarters told a grim story. German forces were closing in from 3 directions. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was infiltrating from the south and east. Panzerlehr was pushing from the east. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division threatened from the north. By noon on December 20th, the last road into Bastogne, the highway to Neufchâteau, was cut. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Pier, positioned his men in foxholes along the perimeter. We could hear German tanks moving in the darkness beyond our lines. The men were digging their foxholes deeper, using helmets and bare hands when entrenching tools broke in the frozen ground. The temperature was near zero. Men's feet were already turning black from frostbite. Inside Bastogne, the civilian population of 3,000 huddled in cellars as German artillery began systematically destroying the town. Renée Lemaire, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse, worked tirelessly in the aid station en route de Sablon, caring for both American and German wounded. She would not survive the siege. The defenders of Bastogne now numbered approximately 18,000 men. The 101st Airborne Division, with its 11,840 personnel. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division under Colonel William Roberts with approximately 40 operational tanks and 800 men. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion with their M18 Hellcats. The All-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion, and various other artillery and support units. December 21st dawn with visibility less than 100 yards. Thick fog mixed with snow, creating a white shroud that made movement nearly impossible. The U.S. Army Meteorological Report described conditions as extremely adverse for any military operations. For the Germans, this weather was a gift. It grounded the Allied fighter bombers that had terrorized German columns since D-Day. Oberstleutnant von Laukert, commanding elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, noted, "The weather is our ally. Without their aircraft, the Americans are just men like us, and we have more tanks, but the weather cut both ways." German tanks struggled through the mud created by alternating freeze and thaw cycles. Fuel consumption doubled as vehicles fought through the mire. Supply trucks jackknifed on icy roads. Wounded men froze to death before medical aid could reach them. Inside Bastogne's perimeter, ammunition was running dangerously low. The artillery was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical supplies were virtually exhausted after the capture of the medical company on December 19th. Morphine had to be reserved for only the most severe casualties. Food supplies dwindled to 1 meal per day. Private First Class James Sims of the 101st later recalled, "We were eating snow for water. My buddy next to me in the foxhole had his feet frozen to his boots. When the medic finally cut them off, his toes came off with them. He didn't even cry. He was beyond feeling anything." 130 miles south of Bastogne at Verdun, a very different scene was unfolding on December 19th. In a cold, damp French barracks heated by a single pot-bellied stove, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had called an emergency conference of his senior commanders. The room was filled with the top brass of the Allied forces: Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, had just finished briefing them on the German breakthrough. The silence that followed was oppressive. Eisenhower broke it with words that would define the American response. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Patton immediately grinned. Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up. Eisenhower turned serious. George, I need you to attack north. How quickly can you disengage from your current offensive and pivot toward Bastogne? What Patton said next stunned every officer in the room. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room erupted in disbelief. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder actually laughed. Moving an entire corps 90 degrees in winter conditions across 100 miles of icy roads in 48 hours. It was impossible. Eisenhower's face flushed. Don't be fatuous, George. If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready, and you'll go piecemeal. You'll be destroyed. But Patton wasn't boasting. For 3 days, his brilliant operations officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been warning him about the German buildup in the Ardennes. Patton had already prepared 3 different operational plans for exactly this contingency. He had prepositioned fuel dumps, ammunition supplies, and medical units along potential routes north. I'm not being fatuous, Ike, Patton replied calmly. I've already issued preliminary orders. My staff is working on 3 possible axes of advance. All I need is your word. He pulled out a map and showed Eisenhower the routes. I'll use Milliken's 3rd Corps. The 4th Armored will lead, followed by the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions. We'll hit them from Arlon, drive through to Bastogne. Eisenhower studied the map. The distance was staggering. The weather was abysmal. The roads were sheets of ice. But Bastogne had to be relieved. When can you start? December 22nd morning, do it. As Patton left the meeting, he called his headquarters with the prearranged code word, play ball. Those 2 words set in motion one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers in military history. Within hours, 133,000 vehicles began moving north. The entire Third Army, 250,000 men, had to be reoriented. Supply dumps that had been positioned for an offensive into Germany had to be relocated. 20,000 miles of telephone wire had to be restrung. Artillery positions calculated for one direction had to be completely recalculated for another. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, received his orders at 7 o'clock p.m. on December 19th. His unit had to move 150 miles in 19 hours through a blizzard. We drove with blackout lights through the night, he later recalled. Tank commanders stood in their turrets, freezing, guiding drivers who couldn't see the road. Men fell asleep standing up and had to be physically shaken awake. The logistics were staggering. Each Sherman tank consumed 175 gallons of fuel for the journey. The division needed 50,000 gallons just to reach the start line. Fuel trucks drove continuously, many sliding off icy roads into ditches. When trucks broke down, fuel was transferred by hand using 5-gallon jerry cans. Master Sergeant Frank Crusoe of the 4th Armored Maintenance Company worked for 72 straight hours. We changed track blocks on tanks while they were still moving into position. Men's hands froze to the metal. We had cases where skin came off when they pulled their hands away, but nobody stopped. We all knew those paratroopers in Bastogne were counting on us. Back in Bastogne, the situation had become critical. The perimeter had shrunk to less than 16 miles. German artillery had zeroed in on every strong point. The aid stations were overflowing with wounded. At 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They were met by soldiers of F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The German party consisted of Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmuth Hank of Panzer Operations Section, and 2 enlisted men from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Major Wagner carried a typed ultimatum on 2 sheets, one in English, one in German. The English version had been typed on an English typewriter with German diacritical marks added by hand. When brought to the command post, the message was immediately taken to General McAuliffe, who was catching a brief nap in the basement of the Belgian barracks serving as headquarters, when Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore awakened him and said, "The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender." McAuliffe's immediate response was, "Nuts." His staff gathered around as he read the full German message aloud. It spoke of the hopeless position of the American forces, warning that German artillery was ready to annihilate the USA troops, and that only surrender could save them from total annihilation. Colonel Moore asked what the response should be. McAuliffe was genuinely puzzled. "Well, I don't know what to say." Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard spoke up. "What you said first would be hard to beat, General." McAuliffe laughed. "You mean nuts." The room erupted in agreement. McAuliffe sat down and penned the response that would become legendary to the German commander. "Nuts." The American commander. When Colonel Joseph Harper delivered the response to the waiting German officers, they were confused. "Nuts? What does this mean?" Harper couldn't resist. "It means go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you attack again, we'll kill every goddamn German that tries to break into the city." Major Wagner stiffened. "We will kill many Americans. This is war." "On your way, bud," Harper replied. "And good luck to you." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later admitted he was surprised the ultimatum was even sent. "Panzer-Lehr Division sent a parlementaire to Bastogne without my authorization." The demand to surrender was refused, as was to be expected. The German reaction to McAuliffe's defiant response was swift and brutal. That evening, the Luftwaffe launched its first major bombing raid on Bastogne. For the defenders in their foxholes, it was a preview of hell. Corporal Walter Gordon of Easy Company described the bombing. "The ground shook like an earthquake. Trees burst into flames. Shrapnel whizzed through the air like angry hornets. We pressed ourselves into the frozen earth and prayed." The temperature plummeted to near 10°F. In the foxholes along the perimeter, men took turns sleeping to prevent freezing to death. They learned to urinate in empty ration cans rather than leave their holes. Exposure for even a few minutes could mean death from sniper fire or frostbite. Food had become desperate. The official ration was 1 K ration per day, about 2,800 calories when men needed 4,000 in the extreme cold. Soldiers learned to save the wax-coated cardboard from ration boxes. It burned long enough to heat a canteen of snow into drinkable water. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey found a creative solution. "We discovered that the dead German horses, there were hundreds of them, were frozen solid, fresh meat. We'd hack off chunks with bayonets and cook them over fires made from broken ammunition boxes. It tasted terrible, but it kept us alive." December 24th brought both hope and horror to Bastogne. The weather had finally begun to clear, raising hopes for aerial resupply. But it also enabled the Luftwaffe to launch its most devastating raid. At 8:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, German bombers appeared over Bastogne. One of their bombs scored a direct hit on the aid station where René Lemaire was working. The building collapsed, trapping dozens of wounded soldiers and medical personnel. Corporal Kenneth Moore was outside when the bomb hit. "I heard the explosion and ran toward the building. Where the aid station had been was just a pile of rubble. We could hear voices underneath, men crying for help, calling for their mothers. We dug with our bare hands through the night, pulling out bodies. Miss Lemaire was dead. She stayed with the wounded who couldn't be moved. 30 American soldiers died in that one bombing, along with the Belgian nurse who had become a symbol of hope for the wounded. Augusta Chewy, a Congolese Belgian nurse, survived and continued treating wounded for 30 straight hours after the bombing. As Christmas Eve turned to Christmas Day, Patton's Third Army was struggling through blizzard conditions. The attack that had begun on December 22nd was behind schedule. The 4th Armored Division had advanced only 7 miles in 3 days. Patton, never one for traditional military solutions, had summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill. On December 22nd, "Chaplain, I want you to publish a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if you can't get God to work on our side." O'Neill was dubious. "Sir, it's going to take a pretty thick rug for that kind of praying." "I don't care if it takes a flying carpet," Patton replied. "I want you to pray for good weather." The prayer was printed on 250,000 cards and distributed to every soldier in 3rd Army. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle, whether by divine intervention or meteorological coincidence. December 23rd dawned crystal clear. For the first time in a week, the sun broke through the clouds. The weather break was miraculous. After 7 days of impenetrable fog and snow, visibility suddenly stretched to 10 miles. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in a week. More importantly, the Allied Air Forces could finally fly. At 9:50 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft appeared over Bastogne, dropping colored smoke to mark drop zones. By 11:50 a.m., the sky was filled with C-47 transport planes, 241 of them in perfect formation. Sergeant Jack Agnew of the Pathfinder team recalled, "We popped purple smoke to mark the drop zone. Then we heard them, a low rumble that grew into a roar. The sky turned dark with aircraft. The most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. The paratroopers in Bastogne erupted in cheers. Men climbed out of foxholes, waving their helmets, many with tears streaming down their faces. For 7 days they had been alone. Now the sky was full of help. The first parachutes blossomed at 11:55 a.m. Supplies began raining down, ammunition, medical supplies, food, blankets, and, most critically, artillery shells. Of 1,446 bundles dropped, 95% were successfully recovered. Captain James Parker of the 101st SG for Logistics Section coordinated the recovery. Men ran through artillery fire to grab those bundles. I saw a private get hit by shrapnel, get back up, and drag a bundle to cover with blood streaming down his face. But the Germans hadn't been idle. Anti-aircraft guns positioned around Bastogne opened fire. The C-47s had to fly straight and level at 1,000 feet to drop accurately. At 2:45 a.m. on Christmas morning, German artillery launched the heaviest barrage yet on Bastogne. For 2 hours, shells rained down on the American positions. Then, at 5:30 a.m., 18 Panzer Mark V tanks of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, accompanied by infantry in white camouflage, attacked the western perimeter. The attack was led by Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Mock. His orders from General Koket were simple: Bastogne must fall today. It is the Führer's Christmas wish. The German tanks broke through the first line of foxholes held by Company A, 327th Glider Infantry. Private First Class Kenneth Hendricks was in the second line. The ground was shaking from the tank engines. In the dawn light, they looked like monsters. Our bazooka rounds bounced off their armor, but the Americans had positioned their tank destroyers perfectly. The M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been hidden in rubbled buildings. As the German tanks passed, they opened fire from the flanks. Sergeant Bill Harper commanded one of the Hellcats. We let them roll past, then hit them in the ass where the armor was thin. My gunner, Corporal Johnson, was incredible. 5 shots, 3 kills. By 10 o'clock a.m., all 18 German tanks were burning wrecks. Nearly 400 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. One captured German officer told his interrogators, "Your defense was magnificent. We knew after this morning we could not take Bastogne." General McAuliffe issued his Christmas message to the troops, recounting the German surrender demand and his reply adding, "We have stopped everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west." December 26, 4 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding Sherman Tank Cobra King of the 37th Tank Battalion, peered through his periscope at the Belgian village of Assenois, just 4 miles from Bastogne. For 4 days, the 4th Armored Division had been fighting through German positions, advancing yard by bloody yard. The final assault began at 2:20 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams ordered his battalion forward while calling for artillery support. "I want every gun you've got," he radioed. Within minutes, 2,340 artillery rounds were falling on German positions around Assenois. Bogus recalled the moment. "I could see German troops running from their foxholes as our artillery walked through their positions. When the barrage lifted, Abrams gave the order, 'Move out.' We charged through at full speed, all guns blazing." Private James Hendricks, bow gunner and Cobra King, described the breakthrough. "We went through that town like a hot knife through butter. Germans were shooting at us from windows, doorways, everywhere. Our 75mm main gun was swinging left and right, firing point-blank into buildings. At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King crested a small rise, and Bogus saw American soldiers ahead. They were engineers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, the outer perimeter of Bastogne's defenses. "Come on in," shouted the engineers. "You're the first tanks we've seen in 10 days. Bogus radioed Abrams. Contact with friendly forces established. The siege was broken, but the cost had been terrible. The 37th Tank Battalion had lost 5 killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing in the breakthrough. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion suffered 30 killed and 180 wounded. But the corridor, though only 400 yards wide, was open. The news of the breakthrough spread through Bastogne like wildfire. Men who had been conserving every round of ammunition fired entire clips into the air in celebration. Wounded soldiers in the 8 stations cheered despite their pain. General McAuliffe, maintaining his characteristic calm, simply said, "We're glad to see you boys." But for the Germans, the psychological impact was devastating. General Major Coca wrote in his diary, "The relief of Bastogne is a disaster, not just tactically, but morally. Our soldiers no longer believe we can win. They have seen American determination, and it has broken their spirit." Oberstleutnant Kaufmann of Panzerlehr Division was more blunt. "We threw everything we had at Bastogne, our best troops, our last reserves of tanks and ammunition. And for what? They held, and when we demanded their surrender, they laughed at us nuts." This single word did more damage to German morale than 1,000 bombs. The defenders had started with approximately 18,000 men. By December 26th, the 101st Airborne Division's casualties from December 19th to January 6th would total 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division suffered approximately 500 casualties. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 108 German armored vehicles, while losing only 17 Hellcats. German losses around Bastogne were catastrophic. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division suffered over 60% casualties. Panzerlehr lost 40 to tanks. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had bypassed Bastogne to drive toward the Meuse River, ran out of fuel just for miles from the river and was destroyed by the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. December 27th brought even clearer weather, and with it came the full might of Allied air power. From December 23rd to 27th, Allied aircraft flew over 34,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe, which had started the offensive with 2,000 aircraft, was reduced to fewer than 300 operational planes within a week. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman of the RAF flew a Tempest fighter bomber over the battlefield. It was what we called tank plinking. The Germans had no air cover. We would dive from 8,000 feet, release our rockets at 2,000 feet, and pull up. Below us, German vehicles burned for miles. The most devastating raid came on December 26 when 294 RAF Lancaster bombers attacked German positions around St. Vith, dropping 1,140 tons of bombs. Every road within 3 kilometers became impassable. Unteroffizier Hans Behrens of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division survived the raid. The earth erupted. Buildings disintegrated. Men simply vanished, vaporized. When it ended, I climbed from my shelter to find a moonscape. General McAuliffe specifically credited 19th Tactical Air Command. "If it had not been for your splendid cooperation, we should never have been able to hold out." Throughout the siege, something remarkable had been happening within the German forces, a psychological transformation that Allied intelligence wouldn't fully understand until after the war. German soldiers had entered the offensive filled with propaganda about weak, spoiled Americans who would run at the first sign of serious combat. But what they encountered at Bastogne shattered these illusions. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 26th Volksgrenadier wrote to his wife on December 24th. The letter was found on his body. "The Americans are not what we were told. They fight like devils. Yesterday I saw a single American machine gun crew hold off an entire company for 3 hours. Major Jan Krag of Panzerlehr Division was captured on December 27th. His interrogation statement was remarkable. You have won not because of your numbers or weapons, but because of spirit." At Bastogne, we learned that American soldiers are warriors. While the defense of Bastogne captured headlines, Patton's relief operation represented something even more remarkable. A revolution in operational warfare. The numbers remain staggering. In 72 hours, Patton's Third Army had moved 250,000 men across 100-plus miles of icy roads, repositioned 133,000 vehicles without a single major traffic jam, laid 20,000 miles of telephone wire, established 70 new ammunition supply points, created 40 fuel dumps with 500,000 gallons of gasoline, set up 20 field hospitals, delivered 4,000 tons of ammunition, distributed 62,000 maps. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence officer, later wrote, "What Patton achieved in those 3 days should have been impossible. We calculated it would take a minimum of 6 days just to plan such a movement. The secret was preparation." Unknown to most, Patton had been wargaming this exact scenario for 2 weeks. When other generals dismissed the possibility of a German offensive, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare detailed contingency plans. The medical achievements during the siege deserve special recognition. Despite the capture of most medical supplies and personnel on December 19th, doctors and medics saved lives at remarkable rates. Major René Bowman, chief surgeon of the 101st Airborne, performed 167 operations in 10 days, many without proper anesthetic. We operated by candlelight when the generators failed. We used cognac from Belgian homes when the morphine ran out. Technical Sergeant Eugene Rowe of Easy Company treated over 100 wounded men during the siege, often crawling through artillery bombardments to reach casualties. He never carried a weapon, only medical supplies. The successful defense of Bastogne and Patton's relief operation had consequences far beyond the tactical victory. Hitler's grand offensive, meant to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, had been stopped cold. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall German commander in the West, admitted in his post-war interrogation, "Bastogne was the graveyard of the Ardennes offensive. We needed that road junction by December 18th. When the Americans held for a week, then were reinforced, we knew the offensive had failed. The Germans had committed their entire strategic reserve, 25 divisions, to the offensive. In 6 weeks of fighting, they suffered between 81,000 and 98,000 casualties, lost over 600 tanks and assault guns, and 1,000 aircraft. These were losses Germany could never replace. American casualties were also severe, approximately 75,000 killed, wounded, or missing, with 19,000 killed. But America could replace these losses. By January 1945, fresh divisions were arriving from the United States at the rate of 1 per week. More importantly, the offensive had exhausted Germany's last reserves. When the Soviets launched their winter offensive on January 12, 1945, Germany had no strategic reserves to shift east. The path to Berlin was open. The Battle of Bastogne created legends that endure to this day. McAuliffe's nuts reply entered American military folklore as the epitome of defiance. Patton's relief march became a textbook example studied in military academies worldwide. In December 1984, veterans from both sides returned to Bastogne for the 40th anniversary. Former enemies met as friends. General McAuliffe, then 87, gave the keynote speech, "We fought here not for conquest but for freedom. We fought not from hatred but from duty. And when it was over, we helped rebuild what war had destroyed." Former Hauptmann Hans Detmer of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, who returned for the anniversary, said, "I came here as a conqueror in 1944. I return as a friend. The Americans we fought showed us what democracy really means, not weakness, but strength." Today, the Mardassam Memorial stands on a hill overlooking Bastogne, a star-shaped monument honoring the 76,890 American soldiers killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Every December 16th at 5:30 a.m., the exact moment the German offensive began, bells ring throughout Bastogne. In the town square stands Sherman tank Barracuda from the 11th Armored Division. Children play on it, climbing over the same armor that liberated their grandparents. Vincent Speranza, the paratrooper who brought beer to wounded soldiers, returned many times to Bastogne before his death. The town brewery created airborne beer in his honor. At his final visit in 2019 at age 94, he raised a glass and said, "To the boys who didn't come home, to the people who never forgot, to freedom." The final statistics of the Bastogne operation remain staggering. American forces at Bastogne, initial garrison 18,000, including 11,840 from 101st Airborne. Combat Command B, 10th Armored, 40 operational tanks. Winston Churchill, addressing Parliament in January 1945, declared, "This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery admitted, "The Americans at Bastogne wrote one of the finest chapters in military history. Their stand will be remembered as long as men honor courage." But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from former Wehrmacht General Heinrich von Lowitz, whose 47th Panzer Corps had surrounded Bastogne. In 1954, visiting the memorial, he saluted and said, "They were magnificent enemies who became better friends. They fought not for conquest, but for principle. That is why they deserved to win." The German forces that had mocked the Americans trapped at Bastogne learned a profound lesson. In those frozen December days of 1944, they learned that free men fighting for each other are stronger than any army fighting for conquest. They learned that determination matters more than numbers. They learned that when democracy is pushed to the brink, it pushes back with a force that tyranny can never match. The relief of Bastogne stands as proof that freedom, when truly threatened, will always find its champions. In December 1944, those champions wore the Screaming Eagle of the 101st Airborne and the Triangle of Patton's 3rd Army. They were teenagers from Iowa farms and New York tenements, from Texas ranches and California factories. They were America. On a quiet hill outside Bastogne stands a foxhole preserved exactly as it was in December 1944. A plaque beside it bears a simple inscription. Words spoken by a young paratrooper whose name is lost to history, but whose spirit lives forever. "They've got us surrounded. The poor bastards." That magnificent defiance, that refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. That was the spirit of Bastogne. It was the spirit that held the line against tyranny. It was the spirit that brought Patton's tanks roaring through the snow. And when the moment came, when freedom itself hung in the balance, they answered with a word that will echo through eternity: nuts. The German mockery died in the snow around Bastogne, buried beneath the thunder of Patton's advancing tanks and the unconquerable spirit of surrounded paratroopers who simply refused to quit. In its place grew respect, then admiration, and finally friendship. The fortress of democracy had held. The arsenal of freedom had triumphed, and in that triumph, the future of the free world was secured.